This is Predictions, the podcast where we talk about the future. I'm your host Konstantin, and I'm here with Ingmar.
Hi. Today we want to talk about urbanization, whether this trend will continue or not, and what are the factors that drive it.
Urbanization has been one of the big mega trends of the last century. It's one of those things that you can rely on when making predictions, is that more people will live in cities, percentage-wise, and fewer people will live in the countryside. And very recently even, there has been this shift where now there are more people living in cities than in the countryside. I think this happened only 10 years ago. And what we want to discuss today is whether this trend will continue, how far it will continue, will the countryside completely deplete, or will there be a reverse trend, villagization, ruralization, that turns it around. And I think the core to understanding what the future will be is to understand history. And so, Ingmar, what do you think? Why was there this huge trend in the last 100 years of urbanization?
Yeah, I think the very basic reason is that it has become, so our industry has become less and less focused on just industrial production, or at least the industrial production relies less and less on human labor, and it has become more and more focused on service and on professions that rely on large and very specialized talent pools. And it was just a natural consequence that, as people moved away from working in agriculture to working as, software engineers or accountants, cities became more and more important.
Yeah, and it's interesting because basically the first phase of urbanization happened during the Industrial Revolution, when people moved to cities for working in factories, and factories needed some kind of basic amount of population around them to just staff the factories. And then there is a second wave of urbanization, I would say, in the last 30 years, maybe last 20 years, where cities and clusters of cities are gaining traction worldwide as innovation hubs. So now we're talking about services, and actually the same cities that have been driving the Industrial Revolution are now bleeding populations to other cities, even bigger cities, where people are going to work in the services industry. So there's kind of this staggered approach. And I think that's also, the kind of cities that were thriving during the Industrial Revolution have a bit of a different profile than the cities that are now thriving during the service revolution that we're experiencing. Do you know what I mean?
I'm not sure, actually.
I think in the Industrial Revolution, what the city needed was some minimum amount of people, but it was mostly about cheap labor. So people were leaving their farms, coming to the cities to work in a factory, but it wasn't really that important if the city had 100,000 people or 300,000 people. As long as the industrial resources were around, as long as you had coal in the area, as long as you had waterways, this was a city that would profit. Now it's a bit different. The cities that are profiting now are really profiting through themselves. So their main asset is no longer the waterways or the the resources, but it's really the population. And that's why now it really matters if you're 100,000 people, or if you're 1 million people, or if you're 10 million people. If I'm going to start a company and I go to a small city, of course I can find people to staff the seats, but I will not find the kind of experts that have experience in my industry, in a startup, in this kind of environment. And so I go to cities that are even bigger. I go to cities that have a history, have a startup culture. So I go to New York, I go to Shenzhen, I go to Beijing, I go to Silicon Valley. So I go to these hubs where even more people are clustering. So it's kind of ironic almost, but people living closely in even bigger clusters is becoming even more important in our so-called connected world nowadays than it was maybe 50 years ago.
Yeah, it's actually an interesting point that sort of the first wave of industrialization was all about concentrating like resources for production, including human labor, but it was not so much about concentrating specialized human labor.
Yeah, and you see even bigger cities popping up, right? So now cities, if you're just 1 million people, you maybe don't have all the specialists that you need. So now you need to be like 4 million people, or 10 million people, and I think that's an interesting change, because it's even pushing towards even bigger cities, and you kind of, especially in the Western world, you see this draft where people are leaving smaller cities and moving to even bigger cities, and almost the definition of a city is almost changing. If you're like 50,000 people, that was a big city 100 years ago, but nowadays it's almost a village. And I think it's not just because we have more people in the world, but also because the kind of economy that you could have with 50,000 people 100 years ago was competitive with the economy that you could have with 100,000 or 1 million people, more or less, because I think human labor was more commoditized. So you could, if as long as your factory didn't need more than 50,000 laborers, you were fine.
Yeah.
Nowadays it's much less commoditized, it's much more specialized, and so actually the size of cities becomes even more important.
Yeah.
So I think we are seeing a second wave of urbanization, especially in the developed world, where people are going to cities not to work in factories but to work as specialists. I like to say it's the secondary contraction where like smaller cities are now bleeding into bigger cities.
Yeah, I mean, everything we just said is basically just a way to say that the threshold to have the most profitable economy has risen steadily in the last years, right? And now you could argue that a city that is less than, 1 million inhabitants is not able to have a internationally competitive economy. And that was completely different even 50 years ago, or probably even 30 years ago.
But I think it also has to do with the fact how cities have become attractive to workers. For example, if you look just in the recent podcast, we talked about Tesla coming to Berlin. Why are they going to Berlin? Why not to the south of Germany? Turns out a big part of it was because Tesla thinks that Berlin is an attractive city for people to move to. Yeah. I think 50 years ago, people were less worried whether they would move to a big city or to a small city because they didn't think it would affect their social life as much. But nowadays, it's a bigger factor. So there's also, this effect of the cities being trendy and bigger cities being trendier, like the social aspect that's driving urbanization in the developed world nowadays.
Mm-hmm. So in a way, you could say that we don't only see a specialization in labor, but also a specialization in just what people you want to hang out with, right? People become more specific about what kind of environment they like and what kind of stuff they want to do. And this is kind of parallel with with companies becoming more specific about what people they want to hire.
Actually, that's super interesting if you think about it. So basically, it could be a hypothesis that social media, which is making people more connected worldwide, actually drives the drive into bigger cities.
Yeah.
Because people realize that, there are other people like me in the world. I don't have to adjust. I don't have to become like the others. There's a place where I can meet people who are more like me. And this place usually is the big city, right? Because there's this critical mass. So, interestingly, the internet is favoring the growth of cities. Yeah. That's interesting. That's really interesting because everybody talks about how internet will allow remote work and will actually make cities less important because you can talk to other people across distances more easily and you can collaborate more easily. And yet we have seen this huge trend of people moving to cities, this huge social trend. And that could be an explanation.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the hypothesis there is that you can kind of substitute the lack of diversity in your everyday life in the sense that, so the lack of, people who really have the same interests as you when you live in a small town. So the hypothesis is that you can kind of substitute that with the internet, right? With connecting with people remotely, and in the same way substitute actually going to your workplace physically with working remotely. But it could also be that the ability to see what things exist in the world in the first place have the opposite effect, right?
Yeah, it's like a gateway drug. Yeah. Like you see, there are people like me, there are people who think like me, there are people who want to do the things that I want to do.
I don't have to play soccer.
I want to go to this place. Yeah. I don't have to play soccer. I can play What do hipsters play? Viking chess.
Yeah, probably
in the park.
3D. Yeah. Yeah, interesting.
That's cool.
But there's a point there, especially with remote work, that it seems so ridiculous that you would move to a large city, pay insane amounts of money for housing, when everything you do is just exchanging knowledge and like non-physical labor. So I totally see that point of the internet and remote work kind of working against this urbanization.
I think remote work is growing. I mean, that's not a thought, that's a fact. So more and more people are working remotely, and I think also the kind of work that happens remotely is changing. I think remote work is still being held back a lot behind where it could be. And I think those are mainly two factors that's holding remote work back. Number one is the tooling. Most people who work remotely nowadays, they don't go online in a video conference to talk to their colleagues. So they don't recreate the office atmosphere. And so when you work remotely, especially if you work part-time remote, it ends up being this one day where you have much less supervision, where you have much less interaction, and where you have a lot of people experience this, and I've experienced this myself. You have much less motivation to get something done. So it becomes kind of the slow day, the lazy day. And I think that really hurts remote work, because it makes people think that remote work is like, it's like a day off, but not quite a day off. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that there's the tooling is missing, and also the social change is missing for people to accept that, okay, I'm working remotely, I'm working from home, but I'm still at work, right? So I still have to be reachable. I still have to talk to colleagues. It's okay if other people can see me work. And I think that that's not really there yet. And then there's this huge async work movement, which I really think is really harmful for remote work.
Yeah.
Because it basically,
working, you mean?
asynchronous work. So this idea that, okay, we don't have meetings anymore because we do everything over documents and it's all in GitHub and we just improve it. This works for certain industries to some extent, but I think there are also drawbacks to that. There are disadvantages. There are people who don't work with that as well. And I'm sure most team leads, most bosses, most company owners are scared by that. And I think partially wrongly, partially rightfully, but they're scared and they don't want to do async work. And I think then when people go and they say, I would like to work remotely, and that means I want to work async, then you're like conflating these two things and you're making this a much bigger issue, and it becomes much harder to do the transition, other than just sending people home and telling them, okay, you're going home, but we still want you to be in the meeting. We still want you to be reachable. And I want to see that you're sitting at your desk. Turn on your camera.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I think there are tools that do that already.
There are.
Communication tools where you can actually it's just a virtual space where you can just have the virtual equivalent of working by a person's desk. I agree that kind of stuff is really important, at least for me. And I think I work similar to you in that respect, that I'm not that motivated when I'm not at work. And also it kind of makes me a little bit depressed after a while.
Yeah, I get depressed too.
I enjoy doing it for one time or 1 day a week, something like that, which is already a big advantage. But I think I couldn't do it every day in the way it's done right now. But yeah, I agree. It sounds a lot like a problem that should be solved, and it should be solvable.
Yeah, I mean, let me paint you this picture. Imagine you had in your house an office that is dedicated to work, and that office is built like a virtual office. You know, like you have a big screen on the side of your office where you can see your colleagues, and you have microphones throughout the room, so you can walk around the room, but they can still hear you, so that you don't have to sit at your desk and speak into a microphone. And and you have cameras, so that when you move around the room, they can still see you. And on the other side of your room, maybe you have a whiteboard that's interactive, so you can draw with your colleagues together on the whiteboard. And so the moment you come into your room, you open the door, you turn on your equipment, and you see your colleagues on the screen. And so it's these people that you're sitting with in the office, usually you already have there. And you don't have to call them, you're in the call with them. So somebody says something, you hear them. So I'm not saying this is the way everybody should work. I'm not saying this is perfect. I think there's a place for async work. I'm sure there's a place for other forms of work. But I think this is also something that could exist. And I feel like this whole discussion around remote work equals async is kind of holding back these other developments.
I like that idea. And I think you would have to include like informal chatter and, I mean, which would obviously happen, but I mean, it would probably make sense to kind of simulate a situation of eating lunch together as well.
Yeah,
right?
Famous
Because,
water cooler talk.
yeah, exactly. So I don't know, maybe everybody orders something to eat at the same time, then they sit in their room. I mean, it sounds a little bit ridiculous, but I think that is really the kind of stuff that separates inefficient remote work from efficient remote work. But then again, I know for a fact that there are people who tell me that they're much more efficient working from home. I don't know if they are more lucky with that. Actually, my girlfriend is. She says that when she's at the office, she basically gets distracted all the time. But she's also that kind of person that can just sit down and concentrate for 10 hours straight. I can't. I'm easily distracted by myself. So it's actually, for example, it's actually even better for me to have some type of social supervision. Yeah, but again, that really depends on the person. And I agree, asynchronous work and remote work are different things. And if you mix them up in the discussion, it really hurts.
I think it's a super interesting domain. I think the day when we will start having lunch together in virtually connected rooms, I sound like an IBM executive, but I'm serious. I think that we need to have some amount of social change and some kind of new behaviors for remote work to really take off. And then we need to accept that you're still at work and that you don't have an expectation of privacy when you're working remotely. Yeah. And this also implies that you need a room in your home where you have privacy and you don't have other people walking around in the background. And then that may drive people to work more from the countryside and be less in cities, just to get the curve back to the topic. But even now, without all this social change when it comes to remote work, without the good tooling, by the way, most video conferencing tools are shit because they have huge latency. And if you have a big conference, it's very hard to get what other people are doing right now. There's always a delay between people speaking and then people start speaking at the same time because of that. So that's another whole other topic. But even with the shitty tools that we have right now, even with all the problems and wrong expectations that come with remote work, it's still a huge trend that's growing. And I think that especially for families or for people who want to live in the countryside, maybe don't want to live in the cities where there's a lot of cars, where there's a lot of traffic, for them it becomes more of an option now, maybe than it was 10 years ago. And I think this may be also a trend that may then spill over in other parts of society in the next 10, 20 years. So I could actually imagine some kind of reversal, especially when it comes to the highly connected, highly educated demographic. Maybe people with families, then they would move back to the countryside after being in a city for 10, 20 years. Yeah.
Another interesting thing, I mean, you cite the advantages of living in rural areas. And I think that another development we are going to see is that cities become more attractive.
In terms of traffic, you mean, or in terms of?
Yeah, I mean, at least in Europe, you really can see a shift from, I don't know, in the 60s it was all about cars. Now people start to understand that this is not the way to go, and they start to care more about cyclists. Also, I don't know, I mean, as soon as we have electric cars, this will be an advantage for cities again. And I also think that some of the disadvantages of cities are really going to be alleviated in the near future.
What are those disadvantages, aside from traffic?
Pollution, noise, and dangerous traffic.
Okay.
So that's not aside from traffic. But I mean, you could just name it twice, because I think this is really what families care about. Maybe crime as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure about crime though. That's a political, social thing, and that's a big wild card in the developed world when you talk about the future of cities. This whole political aspect of it, right? So will cities be safe in future? How will communities keep together, support each other in cities? Will people leave cities again to live in more segregated environments? Will cities segregate internally? I think what we've seen is this huge trend of gentrification in the past. So basically the poor, unsafe areas were pushed outwards and the inner cities became safer. But now then you have these banlieues, right? You have the outskirts of the cities that are becoming more dangerous. And I don't know how this will spill back maybe in the inner city center at some point. And I think these are the big unknowns that are always hard to talk about, especially as technologists. And I think they have a very big impact on where people want to live, where people want to go.
Yeah.
That we should never forget to consider.
Yeah. Do you think that, given that cities grow larger, do you think that they will become denser as well?
See, that's another political thing, right? Because density is mostly governed by zoning laws. A lot of density that we enjoy nowadays, if you think maybe about the Paris city center or a London city center, like historic density would be illegal nowadays. I think if you just allow development without any regulation, I think they will become denser because the price is going up in cities for good reasons and for bad reasons. And so there is a motivation to share the space more efficiently. But I'm a bit worried, and this is a political statement, I'm a bit worried that an over-regulation in terms of zoning, not in my backyards, will make it impossible to build enough density in the city centers.
At least in Europe.
Also in the United States as well. I think about Silicon Valley, think about San Francisco, the issues that they're having, the huge fights they have for every new apartment building, regulation that requires that you cannot have more than 2 families on a lot. In certain zoning areas, so it's really crazy. Also, there are other regulations that make it harder, right? So parking regulations, right? You need this many parking spots per apartment.
Yeah.
And there are regulations in Germany that require you to have this much. So you cannot have much more than X amount of floor space per area, right? So if I build something on a square kilometer, I cannot have more than X amount of floor space. And this changes, of course, from area to area. And I understand that we need zoning laws, right? I don't want people to build anything. But I think that zoning laws can also prevent cities from becoming denser. And if you think about a city like Tokyo, which is extremely dense, extremely effective, one thing that Japan doesn't have much are zoning laws.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the fundamental problem here is that the zoning laws are basically made by the people that already live in the city. And yeah. I mean, it's probably a good assumption that people who actually own real estate are a little bit more active in that respect. And so it's in the way not self-regulating, right? So just because there's more demand for housing doesn't mean that the zoning laws will be adapting to that. So yeah, I share that concern actually. I kind of have the hope that transportation will become so much more efficient that we can just increase the size of our cities without increasing the density. But
then the cities would maybe lose some of their appeal, right? Because I think the one thing that's nice in cities nowadays and why people want to move there also is because you can walk a lot of distances, especially when it comes to getting your groceries, going to the post office. I mean, to get your parcels from Amazon.
Well, that's really a European city you're talking about there.
No, I'm also talking about cities like New York or San Francisco. I think people are used to go to the shop, used to go to the bakery, used to get a coffee by foot. And I think that if you have much lower density cities, like maybe LA, something, I think it's a different culture. And yeah, maybe you still have cities there and maybe they have a lot of the benefits that other cities have. But I think some of their appeal will be lost for some people.
Yeah. So we need to change zoning laws. I agree.
Yeah. I try to keep politics a bit out of the podcast always, but I think it's very hard to talk about cities without talking about politics. And there's another political topic that is the prices of real estate in cities. The known fact is that prices of real estate has gone up in cities a lot in the past 10 years, at least since the housing crisis in the United States. Has been very persistent trend in Europe as well. And I believe it's similar in other parts of the world. And I think part of that is need. More people moving to cities needs more space. And then it's also driven by speculation and cheap money, cheap capital, pushing the prices upwards.
I agree. So I think we see kind of a superposition of actually a rise in demand on the one hand, and on the other hand, some type of bubble that is fueled by low base rates from the central bank. At least in Europe, that's the case. But capital is cheap all over the world right now. And many people invest in real estate. And so at least what you see in Germany is a detachment between prices to rent and prices to buy housing.
The returns on investment go down when you buy something because you can only rent it for a very small fraction of your purchase price.
Exactly. And it's also another way of saying that the price becomes detached from demand. But take this with a grain of salt, but because rental prices, at least in Germany, are heavily regulated again. But at least in Berlin, what we don't see is that the prices to buy real estate reflect that regulation. And I think this is a pretty clear sign that the market is not only driven by actually just by demand, but also by the expectation that real estate prices or real estate demand will continue to rise in the future.
Which is called speculation.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think speculation is bad per se, because rising prices also mean that anything that can be built will be built. So it increases the supply a little bit and then has also an effect on rental prices. But I think the detachment between rents and purchase prices in cities is the same detachment that you see between capital and cost of capital, right? Like nowadays, capital, especially if you have access to bigger pools of capital, then capital basically is free. And so you just get your free capital, buy some buildings with it, heavily financed usually, and then you're still better off than paying negative interest rates, right? So there is a strong pressure from capital just trying to find places that are safe, that are basically equivalent to a savings account, and real estate in cities is considered to be something like that. But do you think this will actually hold? Because even in such a situation, people may stop agreeing that real estate is a valuable currency.
You never know, right? But I think that the prices are kind of realistic in the sense that they live a little bit in the future. As you said, it's speculation, so it's the expectation that is going to be like that. So the expectation is that this price is going to be right. And borrowing money is basically traveling to the future, in the sense that you do something that you could actually just afford like in 10 years from now. So the prices that we see are also from the future, right? In a way.
I mean, but traditionally asset prices would reflect returns on investment. So I think they would reflect an expectation of increased rents in 10, 20 years. And I'm not sure if they do that, because you can also, when you have assets and when you have very cheap capital, you can see effects where assets turn into currencies, right? People just start agreeing that this thing is valuable, and its price becomes detached from its utility and becomes detached from its return on investment. It becomes a pure speculative thing, like the price of gold is purely speculative and not related to the utility of gold. And you may see something similar with real estate. And I think that is really harmful for cities, because it makes it harder for people to buy estate in cities, makes it harder for people to move into cities. And that may also be an effect that hurts the trend of urbanization.
Or at least delays it, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, these are always temporary effects, usually, and the bigger trends, the social changes may not be affected by these kind of speculative bubbles or other things. Yeah, they are often temporary only, and then at some point get evened out by the bigger, stronger trend.
Yeah, I also think so. I think the long-term development that just production, or the economy is moving away from industrial production and moving to service-based industries. This is just so fundamental that it's much more long-term, and will be superseded by those kind of effects, which may harm it or at least delay it in a short term. But
But I actually think increased mobility, maybe autonomous cars that allow very long-term very long distance commutes and also especially remote work. They may actually be trends that are significant enough to reverse or at least soften the trend of urbanization that's caused by the specialization of labor.
I also hope so. I mean, that's what I keep telling myself.
Do you want to live in a city?
I'm not sure. I don't think that I necessarily want to do that now.
I keep going back and forth also myself. I think some days I really want to live in the countryside because it's nice. If you can go outside, you have a terrace, maybe you have a garden, you can walk, you have less pollution, less noise. And I have this dream of being able to work remotely, but still be connected to my team through some kind of,
Yeah.
This is an overused term, but I will use it, virtual presence office. And
I heard it actually.
I mean, virtual presence, these little robots, these iPads on two wheels.
Yeah.
That they drive around, and then people say this is the future of medicine or something like that. So, have you seen Big Bang Theory? I think Sheldon uses one at some point.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is virtual presence, but that's not the one I mean. I mean the real one where you can hear your colleagues across distances without having to sit in front of a computer, where you can see them without having to sit in front of your desk, and where you can work with them on a whiteboard without, having to share your computer screen and click with a mouse. So that's what I mean when I talk about virtual presence. And I think that's a huge opportunity if it becomes real for people to move more rurally. And it may also combat the social isolation. You could even think of people having social meetups in these kinds of rooms. But on the other hand, I like living in a city, there's always something going on. I like construction projects. And I like going out and seeing the Tesla factory being built. And I like seeing the new trains running on the Circle Line. And I like all this stuff, and it's exciting. And I think cities are exciting. And so I think there is something that still holds me here.
I also have this daydream of living, I don't know, in a very green valley somewhere in Norway, and having my Starlink dish, so I'm connected to everybody, and just I don't know, sitting in my front yard and working from there.
Backyard, you mean?
Doesn't matter, there's nobody around. So
true.
Yeah, but yeah, I agree. I think that apart from economic factors, there are other factors we also talked about that make people want to move to cities. And so I agree that remote work, if it really becomes big and prevalent, it won't revert that trend of urbanization.
I mean, I think it could revert it, actually. I mean, I was talking about myself, but if I look at the population as a whole, I could imagine that remote work could change that trend, actually. Yeah. So let's put some numbers out there. 1950, you had 30% of the world population living in cities. Now, in 2050, it's about 60. No, wait. That's a projection I'm reading here.
Wow.
I'm cheating.
Spoiler.
I'm cheating. Right. No, I'm not. I'm ignoring the projection. 2020. We have almost 50, a bit more than 50% of the world's population living in cities. So we are just over the tipping point where we have now a majority living in cities. And what would you say is your projection for 2050? So this graph here, just so we are on the same page, it says 60%.
I actually think it's going to be more, because I think it is often underestimated how much we will be able to automate. And because I think this is the most important trend driving the urbanization, I think that it will be around 70% of all people living in large cities. This is the number for the entire world, right? And like in Western countries, we're already quite urbanized, and our industry is already on service-based widely. But then you have like countries in Africa that are still mainly agriculture, and there are still a huge potential. Just to give you a number, I think in Germany it's one farmer producing enough food for 200 people now.
Only. That's still less than in the States, I think.
Yeah, I think, yeah. And so I think if you look at third world countries, there's really a lot of potential.
I completely agree. I think this prediction is for Germany or for the developed world, I would say that we are almost at a peak urbanization, or let's say we're close to a maximum where the whole trend will flatten. But I believe we're already at 85%, something like that. And worldwide, I think the trend is still driven a lot by the shifting of sectors, as you said, from agriculture to industrial and from industrial to service. And so I think that when we look at the whole world, basically we can just interpolate from what we're seeing today in the developed world and assume that the same thing will happen to the developing world, barring any big catastrophes like climate change and political issues. But if you disregard these at the moment, and if you assume that they don't affect these major trends, which is a big if, then I would just say in 2050, which is another 30 years, people have seen so much development in the developing world that we will probably approach the number of the developed world. So I would also go like even 80%.
Yeah. Okay.
But that's mostly not driven by any of the trends that we discussed, but just about the bigger trend of sectors shifting that is already completed in the developed world mostly, but is still going on in the world.
Yeah. I mean, we discussed lots of things, but I would agree that this is so powerful and so fundamental that it, on the long term, right, in 30 years, it will basically outlive every other trend that we see now. Okay. Anything else?
No, I think that's it. Wow. Different this time. Different. I see you're taking the lead here. Yeah. No, that's all I wanted to say.
All right.
I think we are ready for the future.